Phil talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. And he wants to solve your problem, whether you know you have one or not. If you do currently have a tax problem, call the office or visit TaxHelpOnline.com. If you don't have a current tax problem, then your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issues of today. One of them being current taxes on the table for being slashed. I heard there was this opportunity to stop the hiring of all the IRS. What's going on with that?
Trump was sworn in on Monday. He signed about 45 or 46 different executive orders on Monday before he went to all the inaugural balls. And one of them was a hiring freeze. All federal employees in all government agencies are now subject to a hiring freeze. This applies to the IRS. The executive order specifically provides that the Internal Revenue Service is covered by the hiring freeze, despite the fact that in 2023, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, Congress funded the hiring of 80,000 or 85,000 additional IRS employees over the span of about a 10-year window. So Trump has now frozen that hiring spree that the IRS was going to go on over the next 10 years. Now, the other fascinating thing about this executive order here is it's a 90-day moratorium, right? It's not an indefinite freeze. And the idea is the Office of Government Efficiency, the DOGE, is going to start taking a look at all of the employment situations in all of these various government agencies, and they're going to do an evaluation about duplication and unnecessary employment and so forth, and start making recommendations to cut the duplication. Well, okay, so it's a 90-day freeze. The Office of Management and Budget has to provide a report to the DOGE to say, okay, here's what's going on with the personnel, but that 90-day freeze does not apply to the IRS. It's an ongoing freeze for the IRS, and so that is going to be something that's going to be looked at through legislation going forward. And I believe that the Trump administration is going to be very serious about cutting the scope of the Internal Revenue Service going forward.
So basically, the IRS isn't getting several billions of dollars to hire 80,000 new employees in order to audit a bunch of people. Instead, what's happening is they're getting their budget cut.
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Inflation Reduction Act funding was $80 billion spread over 10 years. Much of the money was going to be used to hire 80,000 more IRS employees. They had the thing all broken down as to how they were going to spend the money, but the vast majority of the money was going to be spent in enforcement, tax collection, audits, that sort of thing. All right, very little of the money, only about 3 or 4% of the money, was going to be spent for taxpayer assistance, education, and outreach, which, in my opinion, is where the money should be spent. But that money's already been appropriated. All right, then 2 years later, Congress clawed back $20 billion of the money, so it went from 80 to 60, and now the Trump administration is talking about cutting it even further. They haven't done so yet, because remember, the Inflation Adjustment Act was a congressional appropriation. The president does not have the authority with executive order to undercut any congressional law. The only thing that an executive order can do is carry out the administrative functions of the executive branch of government. One administrative function is to handle and manage the employees of the administration, which of course Treasury Department employees are part of that. So the Trump administration is saying we're not hiring anymore. They can't cut the budget yet. Only Congress can do that anymore until we get our arms around what's going on with this situation.
So basically, that $80 billion that was appropriated, some of it got clawed back already, and the hiring freeze is looking to claw back even more of it before the budget actually gets cut, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I would say that's true. They've stopped hiring additional IRS employees, despite the fact that that the agency has the money to do it. There's going to be no additional IRS employees hired for at least the next 90 days, and probably longer than that, because of the peculiar situation we have with the IRS as a result of that $60 billion appropriation.
What does that mean for taxpayers who might actually be going through issues right now?
Well, just because you're going through an issue right now doesn't mean the issue is automatically going to go away. You got to remember, the 80,000 IRS employees that they were going to hire was going to be spread over 10 years. The IRS currently has roughly 85,000 IRS employees, right? In fact, they've got probably a few more than that, because the agency has been hiring over the last 2 years. Now, at the same time, there's a lot of attrition in the IRS. And so these people that were running around saying that this $80 billion worth of funding was going to double the number of IRS employees just isn't accurate, because the fact of the matter is they lose thousands of employees every single year to retirement and attrition. attrition. And about 30% of the IRS's workforce is eligible to retire over the next couple of years. They weren't going to double the size of the agency anyway. So the agency certainly is functional. They're certainly operational. There's no doubt about that. Somebody that's going through an audit, that audit's not going to go away. Somebody that's going through a tax collection situation right now, that's not just going to go away just because the IRS is facing these personnel and money issues. The fact of the matter is that agency is still well funded. Remember, the $80 billion reduced to 60, that was supplemental funding. The main appropriation to the Internal Revenue Service is about $12.5 billion a year, right? So they still got a heck of a lot of money and a heck of a lot of employees to go out there and get in the face of individuals and businesses.
So what does this mean for the next, 10 years? The Inflation Reduction Act had basically a 10-year IRS employee replacement plan, is what I'm hearing. So them clawing back some of that money and Trump freezing the hiring process, does that mean we're going to see the IRS die to attrition? Or is that part of the destroy the IRS, get rid of the income tax plan?
Well, they better not do it that way, because if they try to choke the IRS off slowly by eliminating employees through attrition, we are going to have a disaster on our hands that people can't possibly imagine. Because just because there's no administrative agency, you still got to file tax returns, you still got to pay taxes, you still got to do all the reporting, you got to do all the things that the law requires. There's just no question about that. What it means, the administration and Congress are going to have to take a very hard look at what goes on with this agency here in the next probably 90 days to 6 months. That's really what it means. It sets up a situation where a hard look is going to be taken at how this agency is going to be managed over the next 4 years.
Basically, it sounds like Trump is going to actually be focusing a lot on the campaign promise of dealing with the taxes in our country, because he ran on getting rid of income taxes. He ran on no taxes on tips, no taxes on Social Security. He's ran on all these different taxes and tariffs and whatnot. What sign of life do we have in this movement to eliminate the income tax?
There are some signs of life, and it's a good way to put it. Tax reform has got to be a major issue of this administration. Tax reform is always a major issue, because no matter what side of the aisle you're on, taxes are always the number one issue that seems like is on the plate for Congress. If you're a leftist congressman, you want to raise taxes. If you're a conservative congressman, you want to cut taxes. Same with the presidents. And so it's always an issue, no doubt about that. We have a unique problem right now that Congress is facing. And the unique problem that we have is the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which took effect in January of 2018. That was Trump's first tax bill, right? That bill expires at the end of 2025.
Right.
And if that law, if that law is allowed to expire, then there's going to be across-the-board tax increases for middle-income Americans throughout the United States. There's no question about that. So it is a major priority for Trump and the Congress to get that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act renewed and refined to the extent that they want to use the opportunity now that they have to cut taxes even further and reform the system even more. You talked about Trump's campaign promises. There were three main things. Number one is to cut taxes on Social Security. Number two is to cut taxes on overtime pay. And number three is to cut taxes on tips. Now, there's no question in my mind that cutting taxes on Social Security is a very good idea. Cutting taxes on overtime and cutting taxes on tips is going to be a very difficult thing to get through Congress, number one, and it's going to be very difficult to administer if they do get it through. And so I think that's going to be very, very problematic. Now, on the other hand, the idea of instituting a real honest-to-goodness study of the abolition of the income tax entirely and going to some alternative system, I think that's a very real possibility under this Trump administration.
Well, we've got the sign of life from, what was it, Buddy Carter with his latest tee-up of the fair tax in Congress, but we've seen that a number of times now. So what do you think the shot of that having any legs this time around? Billy Long is the nominee for the IRS commissioner, who happens to support Buddy Carter, who has been pushing the fair tax in Congress again, which is it's half a dozen times they've tried to done this.
That is exactly right. Buddy Carter is a representative from the state of Georgia who is now introduced into Congress again for the, fifth or sixth time, the fair tax, which is a plan to abolish the individual income tax and adopt a retail sales tax to raise the revenue. It would not abolish the tax code entirely, nor would it abolish the Internal Revenue Service, but but it is no question a
Step in the right direction.
And so this is something that it's not gone anywhere in the past is the problem.
Just dies on the floor every single time. Why? Do we want to talk about how Congress has a vested interest in keeping the tax code complicated? I talked about this with someone the other day. I sent them your information because they had a tax problem. You know, they haven't filed since 2017 or whatever because family issue got them behind 1 year, and then now they don't have records. The same story we've heard time and time again. When I was working on the phones in the office, every single day I'd hear that story 3 times a day. Congress has a vested interest in keeping these people fearful, intimidated, and confused. Why?
Well, because it's a revenue mechanism. If people are confused, they end up paying more taxes than they owe. If people are terrified, they end up rolling over when the IRS calls them on the phone or the IRS sends a letter. You know, for decades, the Internal Revenue Service has been sending mail out to people that is either wrong or incomprehensible, telling folks they owe more money, and people, generally speaking, just roll over and pay it unless it's such a substantial bill that they can't afford to roll over and pay it. Then they end up in a fight with the IRS, but most people are unarmed when it comes to fighting the IRS, and so they don't know how to get it done anyway. And so now they end up on the business end of IRS collection, which is wage levies, bank levies, property seizures, and tax liens, and the IRS ends up collecting the money anyway. This is one of the reasons why I am completely convinced that we have a tax code that consists of more than 4 million words and was changed more than 6,000 times just since 2001 alone. Congress keeps stirring the pot. It really doesn't benefit the American people at all. It just makes it worse for the American people. And the fact of the matter is people just get so confused that they give up.
It's worse because, you know, people have this image of the IRS knowing exactly what they owe, and instead they have to do all this calculation and stuff on their own, when in reality, the IRS doesn't have any idea what you owe any more than you have any idea what you owe. And you have to comb through every single clause of the tax code in order to really get down to the nitty gritty, which is worse because then you also have to be the one to prove that you did it right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The IRS never has to prove you did it wrong. There's some exceptions to that, but they're very rare, very narrow. You have to prove you did it right. So if you're in an audit and a collection situation and you say, well, no, I'm entitled to this or I'm entitled to that, burden of proof is on you. So if the IRS comes knocking on your door and they want to do an audit, they don't have to prove your tax return is wrong to assess you additional revenue. You have to prove the return is correct in order to prevent that assessment.
It's backwards litigation. It's backwards in terms of the presumption of innocence. So that's just an entirely backwards program.
It's backwards in the sense of our traditional system of jurisprudence, no question about it. The person that makes the claim has to prove that the claim is accurate. Well, the IRS twists that and the courts twist that, and they say, well, the tax return is your claim. You made the claim to the government that you're entitled to this, this, and this, and so therefore the burden of proof is on you. You're the claimant. Well, that's twisted because the law creates the burden for you to file the return in the first place. Right? If the law didn't create that burden, nobody would be filing tax returns. It's a twisted, illogical, legal thinking, no doubt about it.
Mental gymnastics at the very least. So with this new IRS commissioner, which was it, Billy Carter or Buddy Long? One of the two.
Billy Long.
Billy Long is the new commissioner nominee. So with this new nominee who has in the past supported the fair tax, that doesn't help us in Congress though, does it?
No, it doesn't help in Congress, but it does help from the standpoint of, if he's confirmed, a leader of a major government organization trying to shut down that very government organization. But Congress is the only one with the power to close down any government agency, whether it's the IRS or anybody else. So that the problem with Billy Long, and really the rap, and I think this could be the death knell, frankly, for the nomination, is he just has no experience with running an organization the size of the IRS. Never mind the Inflation Adjustment Act for just a second. IRS currently has budget right now is roughly $20 billion. Even if you take away Inflation Adjustment Act money, it's still $12.5 billion. This is a massive government agency. It's the largest police force in the world, no doubt the largest in the country, probably the largest in the world. I can't imagine another government law enforcement agency bigger than the IRS. And you got to have some experience running an organization like that. There's no question about it. And he doesn't have any. Not only that, he's not a tax professional. He's not an attorney, not an accountant, not an enrolled agent. He's never been in the tax world, whether he's functioned as a tax preparer or a tax litigator or even a tax planner. He's just not in that world. So one has to wonder why he was nominated. And I think the only answer is because he supports dismantling dismantling the agency. I think that might be good enough for Trump.
Well, I mean, that might be good enough for me too. I mean, if you think about it from the terms of if he doesn't have any experience running a giant organization, does he need that in order to run it into the ground? Because that's kind of the point we're hoping for, isn't it? Is to see the IRS get run into the ground.
It's really not. We want to bring the plane in for a nice soft landing. I don't think we want to crash it into the side.
You don't want to hit the second tower.
Crashing it into the side of a mountain.
You don't want to hit the second tower with this plane?
I don't want to hit the second tower.
So running the IRS into the ground isn't a solid plan from a standpoint of taxpayers' rights purely, right?
I don't have any problem with dismantling the IRS lock, stock, and barrel. I've been advocating that since the early 1990s. Take it apart, right? Dismantle the Internal Revenue Code. Trash it as we know it. Abolish the individual income tax and the corporate income tax while we're at it. Abolish the estate and gift tax and the Social Security tax. Not the benefit program, but the tax. I would abolish all of those things. But we got to do it in a systematic, orderly manner. You can't just pull the plug on these things without some cohesive plan going forward.
Can't you, though? I mean, there's a lot of people who would just love to see the IRS get shuttered immediately and never look back. I'm sure there would be cheering in the streets if that happened. However, what do you think the commissioner could genuinely do from the point of leading the IRS in order to push towards getting the IRS dismantled the right way?
What he can do, and what would be different from every other commissioner, is telling the truth to Congress about really what's going on inside the IRS in terms of the inefficiency and the error ratios and the abuse of taxpayers' rights to the extent that that goes on. Whereas every other commissioner says, we're making progress here and we're doing this well and we've turned this around and we fixed that. And the problems are rampant in the Internal Revenue Service. There's no doubt about that. And a commissioner could go to Congress and say, look, this is really what we're dealing with here. And this is why the system is untenable. This is why we can't have 162 million individual tax returns filed every year. We can't have another 105 million business tax returns filed every year. We can't have 4.5 billion information returns filed every year. It is impossible to manage that level of data and to use that data effectively. It is impossible to raise the nation's revenue when you've got that kind of demand that's placed on the American taxpayer. There's got to be a better way to do it.
It's the difference between a commissioner who shines the turd and one who puts on a rubber glove, picks it up, and makes Congress smell the turd, is what you're trying to say.
I might use different terms, but yeah, that's probably good. Because I really don't know anything about the guy. When he was in Congress, he wasn't on any of the tax writing committees. He was on an Energy and Commerce Committee, other than supporting the fair tax, which is a big deal. I just don't know where he stands on any of this.
Well, if he hasn't had any records of him being on certain committees in Congress, maybe we can give him the benefit of the doubt in that he really doesn't want to be a part of the problem in Congress. He wants to be a part of the solution. Clearly supporting the fair tax.
Yeah, I'm willing to give him that benefit of the doubt, sure. There's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. I don't care what kind of a tax problem you have. I don't care how long you've had the problem. I don't care what you've tried to do to fix the problem. I don't care who's told you you can't fix the problem. There's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. If you've got a problem right now, contact me at TaxHelpOnline.com. That's TaxHelpOnline.com.